Most don't know the difference between history and the past. The past is objective, simply a record of what happened before. It's fixed yet shrouded. Until seamless time travel is invented, the past will always be unknowable. History is the stories told about the past, the claims made, the folks remembered. History is constructed, purposely and deliberately. Future historians could collectively choose to devote decades of academic study to 2022 and completely forget 2023. That sounds ridiculous, but look over the past enough and you'll find unwritten corners of it, places, times that history has chosen to look away from. And today we'll be investigating one of the least investigated episodes of American history, the business plot. Welcome all to No One Is Competent, the premier history comedy podcast dedicated to showing off how everyone is terrible at pretty much everything they've ever done. I am your first host, Azalea, the bombastic redneck who never knows when to shut up, and I am joined by the soft-spoken man who keeps me honest, the big boy with the big brain, Jay. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I'm doing okay. Looking forward to talking about the group of people who we've never really covered on this podcast before. Of course, that being fascists.
Listen, buddy. Listen. You told me to do the episode. I only know about so many things. It was listen, I was reading it's fine. It's gonna be fine. There's everyone loves fascism.
Yeah.
That quote's gonna be taken out of context, isn't it? I could edit that out, but I won't. This is, once again, the No One Is Competent podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at @not_competent. You can email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Jay, what's your Twitter?
That would be at Jaharis48.
Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. And, what else? Yes. Folks, we have a YouTube. Go sub. Go ask us your questions in the comment section. Try to be polite to the other beautiful people there, though I know some of them can be a little unseemly. Also, we are up to, I think, a grand total of 4 or 5 reviews on the Apple Podcasting app, and I would love if I could get that to a nice, clean double digits, people. Please, go, take some time, give us 5 stars, write, yo, these dudes have really sexy voices. That's all you gotta do. That's all we ask. We would really, it would make my damn day. It was Jay's birthday 10 days ago. Come on, give him some love. Happy 47th birthday, by the way.
Thank you.
All right, let's get into this before I absolutely fall asleep. We're recording on a Sunday after daylight savings time or saving time. Who gives a shit? I don't respect governments enough to get their fucking absolutely illogical bullshit correct. Spring forward, fall back. It's fucking nonsense ass. I also had to run double duty at church this morning. I was doing both our sound mixing and our camera directing at once, which is supposed to be done for 2 people. And, it's a lot like pleasuring 2 women at once. Even if you're really good and successful at it, the whole thing just leaves you, hollow and exhausted. And now I'm doing this. So that's the mental state I am in. Slightly deranged. Jay, banter with me.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's been a normal morning for me. Can't really relate.
I mean, have you ever related to me about anything? Ever?
Hopefully not.
That felt great. Okay, so we're gonna tell our story in a slightly convoluted this way this time. Where I told you we're talking about the business plot, but we're not really gonna tell you what that is until later. This episode is grounded in what one might call less than optimal history. Jay, can we agree on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of mythos revolving around the business plot, depending on who you believe. Either it totally didn't exist whatsoever, or it was, a grand conspiracy that was just about to happen if it wasn't for the heroic actions of Smedley Butler.
Yeah. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna ground this episode in things that absolutely did happen and historical trends. And then we are going to end it by getting to the less clear stuff. And what we want to make clear is that America is part of a system. There's other countries in the world, and the history and the politics of those countries can affect the United States, as much as Americans might be loath to admit it, and very much was affecting the United States in the 30s. And we have to kick it off, I suppose, with the Industrial Revolution. Which is one of the most important and most tragic things that ever happened to humanity. So you got the 18th and 19th centuries. And they set up everything that obviously happens in the 20th century. Industrialization would provide both the means for the rapid expansion in the size and lethality of the militaries of the great imperial powers of the world, and the tools of which they would secure their increasingly vast empires and compete with one another for dominance. These interlocking games of power would explode in 1914, sparking the First World War.
Yeah, while the motivations behind the combatants of World War I were ones that had been pretty familiar throughout history, Germany's desire to dominate Europe and achieve dominion over the seas was not entirely dissimilar to that of Napoleon's a century prior, but the horrendous death toll of the war and the economic upheaval that came with it gave fuel to new movements and causes that had originally began in response to the social changes brought about by industrialization.
The way that people viewed war really changed after World War I, right? It was much harder to ever declare gallantry in it. I mean, war was never heroic, war was never gallant, war was never glorious, but it's a whole lot harder to keep the lie going when you have a million French corpses piled up like spilled cordwood in the Somme, right?
Yeah.
It was just a manifest horror that everyone could see with their eyes, and it made it much harder for the propagandists to lie about it.
Yeah, not impossible, but they would have to come up with some new lines. Yeah, socialism, communism, and anarchism all had their origins in the 19th century, but they took on a new prominence thanks to the war. And this will be most visible in Russia, where the exhausted and decrepit Tsarist regime would lose its grip over the country, paving the way for the communist Bolsheviks to seize power in 1917.
Arguably the most important outcome of World War I was the Russian Revolution, where a 300-year-old dynasty and a 1,000-year-old system was overthrown for a completely new form of government. This was really great and objectively better what came before, but it did involve a lot of people in power getting killed and destabilized half the continent. So everyone in charge of every other country is now paranoid as shit about communists, socialists, anarchists, and anything fun. Remember, the ruling class of every country at this point in history, they feel like they have more in common with the rulers of other countries than their own population, right?
Yeah.
People knew Nicholas and Alexandra. A lot of them knew Nicky by name, and now they've heard he's been shot in a basement somewhere, and they're all looking around at their populations, getting increasingly nervous. At the top of the 20s, it was a very real possibility to everyone that more countries would fall to communism and kill everyone who was exploiting everyone else.
Yeah,
Again, we now know, like, the sort of expanse of the communist revolution. We know, like, which countries reformed or fell or whatever you want to say and which didn't. But if you're standing in a nation in 1919, like, it could look to you like the whole thing's about to fall.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get more into Germany later, but like, if you're in 1919, it would not be an unsafe bet to say that Germany is going to become communist. The communists won the local elections in Britain around this time period. And the Soviet Union, the just being born Soviet Union, you had people like Trotsky who were committed to carrying out the revolution around the world, which, according to Marxist ideology, is, what's desirable.
In 1912, Eugene Debs won 1 million votes for president on the communist ticket in America, running from prison. Like, this stuff is everywhere. And you gotta remember, these states that are trying to defend from communism are incredibly weak. They've been hollowed out by World War I. Their armies are utterly debilitated. Their economies are in shambles. Their people are starving. And into this space where regimes lack legitimacy or the ability to provide for the people, fascism stepped in to offer an alternative. Previously, we've characterized fascism as an ideology that comes from venerating an in-group to its highest levels, but now we're gonna build on that.
Yeah, fascism is in many ways an intellectual response to liberalism. It looks at the ideals that all men are created equal, that righteous government lies in the consent of the governed, that everyone deserves to participate, and that minority interests should be protected, and it says, what if no? Fascism is a brute force ideology. It throws out all ideals to grasp at power for power's sake. The fascist has no ideals, only goals. If they can achieve power using democracy, they'll do so. If they can achieve power by shooting you in the head, they'll do so. For example, many modern fascists tend to claim to be ardent advocates of free speech, the idea that all ideas have merit. They'll use this as a shield when attacked for their racist rhetoric, but as soon as they have power, they'll turn around and restrict any speech that doesn't favor them. They have no ideals, only goals.
Fascists encourage each other to stop thinking. They don't just see the world in black and white, but in extreme black and white. It's not just that we're good and they're bad. No, we are holy and they are satanic. The in-group is so important that all who defy it should be met with death, without even considering anything else. Followers should follow orders without question. They should look the same and never speak their own opinions. In reward, they can use unlimited violence against their foes, brutalizing them without hesitation. And it's worth noting that what we call fascism is being developed, like, in these years, building up to and right after World War I in Italy. And a lot of those philosophers we're talking about, they were obsessed with motion, action, industrialization, and war. They prized action for action's sake, damning the consequences. The idea was that only a strong man ripping down all the niceties of society could burn the world into a new glorious dawn. You can see how this ideology is powerful, maybe intoxicating to young men. And in 1919, Europe had a lot of young men in it, in a uniquely dangerous situation.
The brute force will to power, built on killing anyone who didn't agree with you and refusing to apologize, would roll through Europe like a plague. One by one, nations would fall, and everyone else would start to see fascism as either an inevitable next stage to society or a cancer that must be fought at every step. This plague would even spread to America. though the story is almost never told, and we're going to tell it by telling you 3 separate stories first, all of which built on each other in a chain.
Like I said before, we must start with Italy and the March on Rome. In the aftermath of World War I, Italy was a wreck. It had technically won the war, been on the winning side, but it didn't get much out of it, despite suffering heavy losses. This, of course, makes the people mad and the government extremely weak. And you have lots and lots of people throwing around revolutionary ideas. You have communists, anarchists, and what will become fascists all sort of mingling and honestly overlapping a lot. There are people who will describe philosophies or take actions in this period that are almost hard to pinned down. People will start as anarchists and then slide to fascists or vice versa. There's a lot of just like sort of anger and fervor, and the revolution was in the air, as they say. A major factor in all of the unrest are all of the freshly demobilized soldiers who just spent the last 4 years getting really good at killing and are traumatized out of the ass. They now have few jobs and little to do, so they start some uprisings and revolts that don't particularly go well. This phenomenon of World War I vets getting up to some shit will be a recurring trend. Somebody jot that down. You have multiple attempts to overthrow like regional capitals in this time. The city of Fiume famously gets occupied for like a year and is this weird proto-fascist anarchist commune. It's a real mess. And watching all this mess was a journalist / veteran / politician named Benito Mussolini. So who is this guy? Mussolini was raised socialist. He was actually named after a socialist Mexican politician. And as a youth, he yearned for a violent socialist revolution. But after international socialism failed at the start of World War I, which, hell, could be an episode of this podcast all of its own, he was converted by Gabriele D'Annunzio to fascism. Gabriele D'Annunzio, of course, is a name that you will often see as a sort of inventor of fascism. I kind of reject the idea that a philosophy and movement as broad as fascism could have a single, quote, inventor, but the guy did a lot of the intellectual groundwork on what fascism, what would be eventually called fascism. It is very appropriate to study him as one of the early guys. While he was a journalist, Mussolini was a big advocate of Italy joining the war, and he fought in it and was just as mad as everybody else that Italy got very little for their efforts. In the immediate years afterwards, he sees all these violent revolutions against the government fail, and what he figures out is that if he wants to be successful, instead of replacing the government, he needs to take over the government.
Yeah, Mussolini would go on to found the Fascist Party of Italy and would recruit idle veterans. He would basically just tell them to beat up political opponents in the streets. He would give them something to do. These, of course, would be the black shirts, the muscle of Mussolini's revolution. In 1921, Mussolini and several other fascists were elected to parliament, but despite the party's rapid success, they're still pretty small. The leftist parties had 5 times the seats. And at the time, Italy was a constitutional monarchy, with the king still the head of state, and the king, this being Victor Emmanuel III, was very conscious of the fact that he could easily lose his throne amongst all this political turmoil. A lot of European monarchs had not survived in both the 19th and early 20th centuries. Not the best time to be a monarch.
Frankly, considering everything that's been going down in Italy for the past 100 years, it's amazing they still have a king at this point.
Yeah. By 1922, the fascists had gone from about 100 people to about 300,000 in the span of 3 years, and they'd gotten really good at those street fights with the leftists. They also controlled newspapers, and Mussolini replaced trade unions, which they were often fighting, with fascist equivalents to build power. Much of their crimes were ignored by local police who were sympathetic. By using his black shirts to suppress socialists and break general strikes, Mussolini ingratiates himself to local business leaders and the middle class, especially in Milan, which is one of the industrial centers in Italy at the time, and still to this day. And while the communists and anarchists are rising up to respond to this violence, but that would only push the establishment towards Mussolini as they feared the left even more.
On October the 24th of 1922, and yes, it is amazing how fast the fascist party goes from being invented to doing their big thing, Mussolini spoke before 60,000 militants in Milan and told them to march on Rome. This was then called the March on Rome. The stated point at the time was to undemocratically take over the government. So he's saying, like, I want to now be in charge of the government, and I do not care whether or not I have the will, that we're just going to do it. So Mussolini's followers, both in Milan and all over Italy, start gathering guns from Allied cop stations and makeshift weapons and start marching on Rome in the thousands from all across Italy. This happens over the course of days and weeks, this sort of like mass mobilization of the country, of people just sort of coming towards Rome. It's an attack on the government, but it's like a slow one, and it's more, let's use a term, menacing than it is actually threatening. This freaks the government out. The king is told by his generals that the military doesn't want to fight the fascists because the military really likes the fascists. I think the term that the general uses is, he says something to the effect of that the military will do its job, but like either not willingly or they're not going to feel good about it. Okay? And all of the conservatives who back the king agree that fighting the fascists seems like a bad idea. So then the king turns to the liberals, and a bunch of liberal prime ministers who have served before go to the king, and they tell him the best thing that the king can do is to make them prime minister and then Mussolini the vice prime minister, because that'll sort of placate Mussolini and get him on their good side. Basically, everyone wants to use this new popularity and muscle that Mussolini has to their advantage, thinking that they can control it. And everyone thinks that Mussolini is a better alternative than the leftists, who again are far more popular than Mussolini is, if they don't have as many guns. So, the black shirts haven't even reached Rome yet before the king calls Mussolini and offers to make him prime minister.
Only 7 black shirts died on the march. Mussolini would actually just take a train to Rome and meet with the king. Once they reached Rome, Mussolini would declare that 3,000 had died, and it was a great battle, but they've accomplished their goals and restored order. The king would declare that Mussolini had saved the day, and the black shirts would be told to go home.
This whole episode, if this sounds like silly, it's because it is. I would suggest that anyone who wants a little more detail on this listen to the Behind the Bastards episode on this in their Behind the Revolution series, which I kind of used to sort of check myself and provide some of the research for this episode. The March on Rome is so effective, quick, and like insane that a part of me doesn't even want to believe that it's real. Like just how the entire government just like folds, and with Mussolini just making absolutely batshit lies. Like I think there's a line where he shows up to the king and it's just like, "You must excuse my disheveled appearance. I have come from the battlefield," where in the truth, he's like taken a night train from Milan and was just letting his cronies walk through the fields. Like, your ass was never marching, Benito.
Yeah, I think, earlier you were talking about Mussolini versus Hitler, just comparing them. I think Mussolini is maybe a bit more openly honest in a lot of his writings about, like, how much he would just totally lie and how effective it was. And how, like, everything is just, like, about, like, the emotion of fascism and everything. And that, like, lying is meaningless.
It really showcases how a fascism was sort of ahead of the curve. Like, these days we accept that politicians can just make bold-faced lies regularly with very little consequence. And then that's the best way to control the conversation. But it really feels like the fascists sort of, like, pioneered that, or were ahead of the curve on understanding that that was a way you could...
Goebbels in Germany also, somebody who recognized that and talked about that a lot. I mean, that's where, you get the term the big lie from. And speaking of Germany, I guess we should go on to that other country, which is perhaps most famously associated with fascism, even though Italy was first to the fascist prize.
Beer Hall Putsch!
Now, Germany was in an even rougher shape after the war, because they lost it. And they had to create a whole new government of liberals, which would immediately become unpopular as it was saddled with heavy reparation payments by the winning countries. A lot of the economic damage that Germany would face would not come from the reparations, but would basically come from a lot of the liberals, as well as conservatives, sabotaging their own economy to get out of paying reparations, basically to spite the British and French. Yeah, they kind of... There's a lot of, the Nazis themselves would put forward the view that, like, World War I ends and the Germans have to pay reparations, that's all unfair, and it destroys the German economy. That's a very misleading way of viewing history, but one which is unfortunately still very common.
Yeah, Weimar Germany is a place where, on the other hand, like, everyone is lying about everything all of the time. Like, for example, the leadership class of the military, all those generals who were defeated in World War I, essentially, as soon as that happens, just say that they lost because of the Jews. This is where the stabbed in the back narrative begins. Or as we like to say in fighting games, Johns. They were Johning. You know what Johns is, Jay?
Is it when your front lines are collapsing to the British and French, and then you make up that you lost due to socialists and Jews?
Well, yes, but see, the story goes was that there's this guy in Texas named John who every time he lost a game of Street Fighter 2 or Super Smash Bros. Melee, or I think the initial game has been lost to history, he would always make an excuse. He'd say, it's too cold in here, my fingers are clamming up, or someone's touching me, or like, there's something wrong with this controller. And so, eventually, no excuses would be replaced by no Johns. This is an important historical thing for the people at home to know. This is important.
Is it?
So the next bullet point is, so you have this period in Germany of increased hardships at the same time as you have increased freedoms, which, of course, will see the rise of many radical political parties, none more important than a group of so-called National Socialists that are formed in the conservative state of Bavaria. Bavaria is often referred to as the Texas of Germany, but I find that insulting to Texas, so I'll call them the Alberta of Germany instead. The Nazis aimed to be a platform for middle-class Germans, and their platform was basically socialism, but for Aryans. This is where the term National Socialism comes from. Insert rant about how Dinesh D'Souza and anyone who calls the Nazis socialists are idiots. Yada yada. And these Nazis quickly realized that one of their new members, a very sad little man named Adolf Hitler, was really, really good at public speaking. And they get him in front of more and more crowds. It's a misconception that Hitler founded the Nazi Party, but he would quickly become the face of the movement and eventually the out-and-out leader, simply because he was just the most popular guy they had. And a lot of the people who joined the Nazi Party were explicitly fans of him.
The bulk
damn it,
of the...
Jay, you replaced the fry. You can't do that.
I'm sorry. As my 2.5 years of German education, which occurred a decade ago, means I cannot tolerate spelling the Freikorps as, I think you had FRYCOR or something.
Yeah, like fry, like French fry corps.
No.
Freikorps.
No. The Freikorps were basically German militias, a lot of them really militias, giving them a lot of credit. A lot of them were basically just gangs that had formed up after the end of World War I, very right-wing gangs. And the bulk of the Nazis would be members of these former Freikorps. They would go on to be the muscle of Nazi street fighting. The main military connection through the party would be a guy named Ernst Röhm. Now, Ernst Röhm would be the head of the SA, the Sturmabteilung. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Actually, no, it's Sturmabteilung.
I hope you didn't.
Yeah, Sturmabteilung. Probably pronounced that correct. Probably mispronounced that 3 different ways. But yeah, the SA, and they'll become more commonly known as English as the brown shirts because nobody wants to pronounce German words. But yeah, the SA would have access to guns, and allied police and sympathetic judges would give them free rein to attack their enemies. Once again, in Germany, the fascists gave young men something to do, a place for all the trauma and violence and hatred and resentment to go. A sympathetic police presence in the city of Munich was also key to their rise, and it meant that the Nazis would do all the same things the Italians did.
Just for example, there's many cases where Nazis would just kill someone or vandalize a business, or Hitler would be caught doing something, and they would just be released because either the judge or the police president would not investigate or just let them out of prison. That there are dozens, if not hundreds and thousands of cases where the conservative establishment in Bavaria was just we're just not going to enforce the law against these guys.
Yeah. Now, Hitler himself was being convinced in 1924 to model his strategy on the March of Rome, and he would even go to an old general and make him an offer to make him military dictator if he would back a coup. The general, who was Ludendorff, people who are familiar with World War I will know Ludendorff as one of the main figures on the Western Front, was kind of in.
Yeah, he's kind of in. This part's kind of awkward. Ludendorff would sort of end up accidentally betraying what's about to happen. But just to reiterate, Hitler is explicitly motivated to do what he's about to do based on looking at Italy and being wow, that worked pretty well. Hitler is openly a fan of Benito Mussolini. There are a lot of fans of Benito Mussolini all across Europe and soon to be in the United States in this period. A lot of people.
A lot of simps.
He was the. I was about to say he was the Pokemon of his day, but that sounds very mean to Pokemon. I know honestly nothing about that woman. I'm going to say he was the Amaranth, but no, that also sounds mean. I also know nothing about her. Who's an e-girl that I don't like? Alinity. Yeah, she seems distasteful. He was the Alinity of his time. By the way, just a personal thing. If you're complaining about streamers of any gender who you've never watched, why? Like, find something better to do with your time. I just calm down. So, at the same time in 1924, remember, Germany is kind of in the state of economic chaos and social upheaval at this time. A lot of things going on. The governor of Bavaria, which is again just like a state of Germany, he declares a state of emergency in protest of the federal government keeping the reparation payments going. And this governor of Bavaria is going to make a speech in this beer hall in Munich. A beer hall. How do I explain a beer hall? It's like, it's not a bar. Imagine if a bar was like a high school cafeteria, I guess is the best way to visualize a beer hall. It sounds really fun, honestly, if you like beer, which I don't because, I have more than 7 taste buds. But if I did like beer, and I didn't have crippling social anxiety, I imagine I would like beer halls. What about you, Jay?
Probably, yeah. I think so. If, again, if I was into beer, which I'm not.
So, Hitler knows that the leaders of Bavaria are all going to be at the same place, the same night, and he sees his opportunity. He interrupts a speech by the governor to make this big speech about fascism. He's flooded the hall with his supporters. And he sort of gets up on a table and starts yelling. And at the end of the speech, he pulls a gun on the governor of Bavaria and his associates, and he's like, "Gentlemen, let's talk in the back." And this is the signal to all of the Nazis in the beer hall and those scattered across the city. Now, they had rehearsed this. They had planned this. The plan is for them to seize a bunch of strategic locations and weapon caches around the city. The police department, various lookout stations, administrative buildings. And they're going to do this overnight. And at the same time, Hitler is going to have this backroom conversation with all these local politicians. And they're going to back him. And then Ludendorff, that old general, is going to back him. And then they're all going to get together by sunrise. And they're going to march on Berlin just like Mussolini marched on Rome. And it's going to be great. Instead, it would instantly fall apart. Hitler's move was too early and too rash. His Nazis were too drunk or incompetent that night to take the whole city, and those old leaders didn't fall in line. Probably partially because they do not appreciate having a gun shoved in their noses. Quickly, cracks would form, and police and the national government struck back before the Nazis could really get a popular movement started, like the March on Rome. Soon, everyone's arrested. Not that that would do much good.
Yeah, while this was a setback, it would not be a permanent one. Hitler would simply receive basically a slap on the wrist in a trial that was rigged in his favor. The conservatives favored him, and the liberals didn't really take him seriously. The coup and trial put his speeches in front of a wider audience and raised his profile.
Like, Hitler is allowed to just, speak for hours at his own trial and just make, uncriticized, unrebutted remarks for hours to the jury, which are reported on by the press. The judge is just like, yes, you are allowed to do this, and I am going to stop anyone who wants to stop you, because the judge liked him.
Yeah, while in prison, he would write Mein Kampf, which would bolster his cause and set the groundwork for the eventual takeover of power. In 1928, the Nazi Party came ninth in the German federal election, garnering a mere 2.6% of the vote. Now, this actually represented their second consecutive decline in electoral support. They had gone from around 6% to 3% to now 2.6%. The party's fortunes would change, however, with the collapse of the global economy in 1929.
The economy of Weimar Germany had stabilized and even entered a period of growth for much of the 20s, but the Great Depression reverted that almost overnight, as the weak and fractured government proved unable to respond to the economic crisis. Support for the Nazis increased dramatically. In 1930, they captured 18.3% of the vote and became the second largest party in the Reichstag, just behind the Social Democrats. Again, the fascists are a lot less popular than the leftists. Their right-wing paramilitary, the SA, was emboldened into conducting even further campaigns of street violence against communists, socialists, Jews, and other enemies of the party. In 1932, Hitler lost the presidential election to the incumbent war hero Paul von Hindenburg. But the Nazi Party won 37.3% of the vote in the Reichstag election, becoming the largest party in that body. I think a lot, personally, about that 37.3% number, Jay. Like,
Yeah.
I know it's probably unhealthy to look at it too much because it's not like a pure objective measure, but like, I don't know. Knowing that if you assume the people in Weimar Germany are no different than the people you see at, say, your local library every day, and I fundamentally don't think they are, a third of people on this planet will just vote for the fascists.
Yeah.
So that's nice to know.
And, a not insignificant amount of the other parties that, won smaller shares of the votes were very fascist-leaning. Following a series of failed attempts at negotiating government by some of the center-right politicians, one of the politicians, a guy named Franz von Papen, who was a conservative and basically just really good friends with Hindenburg, would convince the president to sack the incumbent chancellor Kurt von Schleicher and appoint Hitler as chancellor in January 1933, with Papen, of course, as vice-chancellor. Now, Franz von Papen viewed Hitler as a useful tool in his own rise to power. Papen had briefly served as chancellor himself in 1932 before being forced out by Schleicher. He had a bitter rivalry with Schleicher and viewed him as his main rival to power. As chancellor, Papen had courted the Nazis by pardoning SA members for the murder of communists. We talked about this beforehand. And he even overthrew the Social Democrat-led government of Prussia. So, Prussia is another one of these states within Germany. And they actually had a Social Democrat, government, a state government. And the central government just went in and arrested all of them, basically. Because...
Excellent.
Yeah. That's just what happens. And, he had even given key jobs to Nazi party members. Hermann Göring, for example, was the basically the Speaker of the Reichstag for a while. In return, he expected Hitler to be loyal and controllable. And he also basically said that, Hindenburg and himself could get rid of Hitler at any time if they needed. Basically just saw Hitler as a pawn. Now, while Hitler initially paid lip service to Papen, he quickly moved to sideline the aristocrat from power. Hitler quickly reneged on his promise to consult Papen on key decisions, and he basically just stacked all the important positions, such as heads of the police in all the various states, with Nazi party members. As much of the German military staff was supportive of Hitler's calls for a strong Germany, Franz von Papen was left without any real base of power, and he would resign in 1934.
As Chancellor, Hitler passed the Enabling Act in March of 1933, giving the office of the Chancellor the power to make laws without the approval of the Reichstag or the president. Essentially, he's the dictator now. In November, he held a new round of Reichstag elections, but only after banning all other political parties using his new powers. Nazis won 92% of the vote, with the remaining 8% going to pro-Nazi independents who were allowed to run. Funny how that happens. Throughout all of this, Hitler had the support of most of Germany's industrial leaders, businessmen, millionaires. There's so many ways to say the word rich, Jay. Like, you know, right now Russia's in the news all the time because they're bombing the shit out of Ukraine and doing war crimes and whatnot. And it's always talked about all these Russian oligarchs. The country is controlled by oligarchs. But it's like, we have oligarchs in America. We just don't call them that. Like, Mark Zuckerberg has control over an obscene amount of communication, news, and data. Like, he basically helps rule the country, but he's just called a billionaire and not an oligarch. I don't know. Branding, you know, it's important. Supporters of these Nazis included Alfred. If you thought Jay was going to be bad, Hugenberg, head of the Telegraph Union, basically the Associated Press, Gustav von Krupp, head of the Krupp family heavy industrial conglomerate, and the boards of other companies such as IG Farben, which did chemicals, AEG, which did electronics, and Telefunken, which did TV and radios. These leaders donated heavily to the Nazi Party in 1933, saving it from bankruptcy, and Hugenberg joined Papen in encouraging Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor in the first place.
Hindenburg's death in 1934 and the Night of the Long Knives, which was Hitler's purge of rivals within and outside of the Nazi Party that same year, would solidify his grasp on power. Hitler assumed the powers of the presidency as well as the existing ones of the chancellor, becoming the Führer and Reichskanzler of Germany.
And now we come to our third story. France. Now I know what you're saying, but Azalea, France didn't become a fascist nation. They fought the Nazis in World War II. Yes, that is completely correct. That does not mean there was not a fascist movement in France. And that does not mean there were not attempts by the French to overthrow their own government for fascists. Let's talk about it. So from 1919 to 1934, which is the year our story is going to take place, France was a society of stable chaos. They had won the war, but owed massive debts to America, and had lost 1.3 million soldiers. People were upset, and they were angry, but they were not as desperate as in other countries. Leftists were very popular in this period, but they were divided amongst several parties that made it really easy for them to get elected and then form a government, but then it made it very hard for the government they formed to actually govern. You had socialists, you had communists, and you had a center-left party, which all hated each other for the reasons that socialists, communists, and center-left folk hate each other now. I mean, you know, look around. Nothing has changed. The right wing was characterized by violent imperialists, monarchists, and business interests. These business interests funded a vociferous media system of racist newspapers and magazines that warned of Jewish infiltration, praised the fascist regime in Italy, and claimed the moderate left government was one step away from a communist revolution. Think of like Newsmax or Fox News or Breitbart in America, who, you know, say that Joe Biden is going to start the communist overthrow of society, right? Is basically the same thing, and it's just as ridiculous. These business interests also funded right-wing street fighting gangs, which fought with anarchists and communists and were formed by the same traumatized soldiers we saw in Italy and Germany. But unlike those countries, things never fully got out of control, and business interests were a little more in the driver's seat. In 1926, for example, France elected a conservative government, and support for those street fighting organizations was promptly cut. In France, we kind of see a tension between the bottom-up, violent, racist, street fighting cast and the still racist but far more interested in lining their pockets business class, who are just kind of like using these violent veterans.
If France never faced a crisis that could truly provoke fascism, there were also other barriers. Conservative French elites thought fascism was too Italian for them, and there was no single magnetic leader for everyone to unite around. I also just think, the fact that when you think of Germany and Italy, a lot of the fascist movements there were based around kind of like revanchism or expansionist sentiment. With Germany, the idea is that they lost their empire at the end of World War I, so they have to recapture it. With
Italy goes and tries to invade Ethiopia.
Yeah, reestablish the new Roman Empire. I mean, that's literally a part of fascist propaganda there. With France, they still had their empire. They had won World War I. I mean, so in Italy, but France had, I guess, more to show of it. And yeah, it was, you didn't have quite as much pressure as two other countries we've gone over.
By the way, if you think this episode is a mess, I once was, at one point, I was going to cover, like, Spain and Portugal and Romania as part of this, and that shit all got cut because it was getting obscenely out of hand. But the phenomenon of, like, people not wanting to say they're fascist because, like, fascism is too Italian or, like, associated with the Italians and like wanting their own thing, that actually kept popping up. I at least saw it in Spain. People kind of want, like, their own philosophy to own instead of feeling like they're followers, while still, like, looking up to Mussolini and, like, wanting to do a similar thing.
France did have, like, a major strategic rivalry with Italy at this moment. There was a lot of just racist sentiment on both countries against each other. So, like, yeah, a lot of French nationalists would not want to come off as being Italian-inspired in a way that, the German nationalists probably didn't care about as much. The 30s would see a series of domestic crises, all before the economy collapsed. We're going through this history pretty quickly, don't worry about it. And the economic collapses would lead to leftists taking power, but again, there was too much infighting in them to really get anything done.
So in 1927, the Croix de Feu is founded, an organization for French veterans. Croix de Feu means cross of fire, and a great thing about talking about the French is you get to pronounce French words, which is really a win-win situation for an English speaker, because if you pronounce the word right, you sound like an educated and erudite person who knows how to pronounce French words. But if you pronounce them wrong, no one gives a shit, because everyone hates the French. It feels like cheating. It is amazing. All episodes going forward from now are going to be about the failures of the French Empire, which we definitely could do sustainably for like 3 years. Anyway, this organization, the Cross of Fire, is founded for French veterans, and it gets more conservative and anti-Semitic as the years pass. They quickly become a powerful political bloc by recruiting more and more members, getting them jobs, and controlling their votes. It's actually fascinating the way the Croix de Feu, like, sort of used networks of soldiers to sort of legitimately help the people in their organization, like, getting them careers and making them loyal.
Yeah.
But they're quickly building power. Now, some people who tell this story tend to put a little too much emphasis on the Croix de Feu. You'll see later why I'm bringing them up so much. It's important to know that they are one of the many far-right organizations that are going to show up later, including Action Française, basically French Action, or what is essentially, in French, Patriot Youth. I love how, like, French Action and Patriot Youth are, like, the most, like, generic sounding far-right organizations you can possibly imagine in France. Like, at least Cross of Fire has a little bit of drama and flair to it. All of this fascist street fighting and the leftists not being able to get anything done and various scandals kind of comes to a head in February 6th of 1934. Where several of these groups, I think the biggest one was actually French Action, attacked the Parliament building in Paris with an attempt to overthrow the government while the Parliament is in session. Now, if me describing that to you makes you think of the American January 6th attack, that would be a very accurate thing to think about. Except it was far less successful while being way more violent. French police opened fire on rioters, and there was an exchange of gunfire that night, with between 15 to 26 people killed, depending on what records I was looking at. Hundreds of people get wounded regardless. And over the next few days, Paris is just engulfed in riots, both by these right-wing factions and communists. It was chaos, and it forces the left-wing government to step down. But French government did persist. There was no authoritarian takeover. Now, I've read a lot of historical analysis of this period. It's worth noting that there's this big, for a long time after World War II, tendency for French historians to argue that France is uniquely suited to being immune from fascism, which of course we all know is nonsense, especially about hearing this story. But as more modern historians have looked at this period, it's basically agreed that one of the big reasons that these French fascists failed is that they didn't unite against a single leader. You may have noticed that we haven't named a name like Mussolini or Hitler. The French had some people. I'm not going to bore you with the names of like the leader of the Cross of Fire or whatnot. But they just like... There was no single demagogue that could have really united the masses, all right? Entrenched business interests and political interests were also too powerful to keep the whole thing from completely falling apart. But the fact that the government almost fell to a violent right-wing veterans would send ripples across the pond. We are now going to talk about what America was up to in the early 30s.
Indeed. The economic and social ills that plagued Europe during the 20s and 30s were not without their parallels in the America of the same time. The Great Depression, which is an event that really deserves its own episode, or maybe a
and we'll
series
get
of
one
episodes.
as soon as I figure out how to talk about economics on this podcast, which is really hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard to talk about economics.
It's not it's not fun.
Well, because just like so you start researching it and like you just immediately run into a shit ton of just conservative propaganda and lies like in the textbooks.
Oh yeah.
So then you just like don't know what to trust, and then you
There's a
end
lot of
up
like
reading some
libertarian
dumb
stuff
shit
floating
and,
around about the Depression, but yeah, what we need to know for this story here is that it brought the Roaring Twenties to a close and led to increase in political violence and demagoguery, similar to and often inspired by the fascist movements of Europe. You know, as the Hoover administration floundered in its attempt to respond to the Depression, people of all stripes increasingly turned to these new radical movements. Left-wing movements also cropped up, as well as, hybrid populist ones, such as, that of Huey Long in Louisiana. This, of course, would bring about memories and fears of the Red Scare, inciting fear amongst conservatives over the rise of communism.
These conservatives concerned with communism, when you look at them, have a surprising amount of concerning involvement with fascists, especially in Germany. In the early 30s, much of America's elite was heavily intertwined with fascists. Mussolini had plenty of admirers, but American business class elite especially fell in love with Nazi Germany. Companies such as Coca-Cola, General Motors, and IBM were heavily involved in the Nazi state. I think most people actually know the sort of funny story about Coca-Cola inventing Fanta as a way to sell a drink in Nazi Germany that could be made with ingredients not barred by the Allied blockade. I think I first read that in a Cracked article in like 2012.
Yeah.
You remember Cracked articles, Jay?
Yeah.
It's like one of the three things from the early teens I'm nostalgic for. IBM, meanwhile, would create the filing system that allowed the Nazis to carry out the Holocaust in Poland. So that's nice. Meanwhile, billionaires like William Randolph Hearst and J.P. Morgan were on the Mussolini side of the spectrum. Moving down to the lower classes, one of the most popular radio shows in the 30s was hosted by Catholic priest Father Charles Coughlin, whose show defended Hitler and often spread anti-Semitic conspiracies. The German-American Bund, an explicitly pro-Nazi political movement, grew to its height in 1939 when it was able to organize a rally of 20,000 supporters in New York City. Its identification with German-American citizens, however, did limit its ability to grow beyond that demographic. I don't know about you, Jay, but I was not taught about all of this shit when my 8th grade and then 11th grade classes were covering the 1930s.
Yeah, like if you ever, you can look up, I encourage you to look up images of that rally. I mean, I'm sure we'll put some on the YouTube, version of this. It is pretty much just like the Nuremberg rally, but in New York, complete with giant images of George Washington flanked with the American flag and the swastika. Yeah, it's pretty striking.
And like 39, had they invaded Poland at that point?
Yeah, I don't remember if this was before or after that specifically, but yeah, Czechoslovakia and the Sudetenland and Anschluss had all happened already by this point.
Shit was already really going down in Germany then. And I mean, we're going to talk about 1934 when plenty of shit was already going down in Germany by then.
Yeah.
Plenty of people could try and pretend that the Germans were, just another country open for business, but very quickly everyone was ignoring a lot of shit shuffled under the carpet.
Yeah. Now, like we mentioned, a lot of these things stem from the First World War, and World War I was a disaster for many of the people involved, even most of the Americans. Soldiers came home to find their jobs had gone and their savings had been drained. And out of the backlash of America using these soldiers and then discarding them, Congress passed the Bonus Bill in 1924, overriding Calvin Coolidge's veto, that would give out back pay to veterans in 1945 or to their families upon death, whichever came first. Of course, the Great Depression would hit in 29, and the veterans would kind of need that money now. It would be campaigned for years. Hoover stopped a bill that would allow them to take the money out as loans, and in 1932, the veterans did the only thing they could do. They went to Washington. Veterans would come from all across America, walking, driving, and hitchhiking the railroad to gather in D.C. By July, there were 45,000 veterans and family members of veterans camped in a tent city in the shadow of the Capitol Dome.
They called this the Bonus Army, or the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Now, if this sounds like the March on Rome, you're right. There are some immediate comparisons that can be made, but this is more of like a grassroots organization, and they don't have like a demagogic leader telling them to do this. This is just a series of nomadic drifters, of which there were plenty in America at the time, and their families all gathering in DC because, frankly, they have nothing else.
Yeah, and they kind of, just want money. They don't want to overthrow the government.
While the government denounced them as communists, locals supported them with food aid, and police refused to arrest them, so more drastic action would need to be taken. On July the 28th, General MacArthur, yes, that MacArthur, ordered gas grenades to be thrown into the camp. This was also overseen by his assistant, Major Eisenhower, yes, that Eisenhower. Then 400 soldiers went in with gas masks and bayonet to clear the camp, along with a cavalry charge led by George Patton. Yes, that George Patton. MacArthur ordered the camp burned to the ground after it was cleared, and he chased the marchers out of town with tanks against President Hoover's orders. A baby died in the camp while all of this gassing and burning was going down. And 2 veterans had been shot earlier that day by police. This is a boondoggle that, like, I want everyone to sort of just imagine this happening, like, today. Like, obviously you can draw parallels to the summer of 2020 protests in DC. But you have the most that was all done by the Department of Justice and by cops, right, this is not even the National Guard. This is just the army going in and driving people out of DC with tear gas, bayonets, horses, and tanks. Okay, this is an insane episode in American history, and this is not popular in the broader American experience. And it's this shocking display that is obviously heavily reported on and shows broader America that there might be a lot of unhappy soldiers with a lot of reasons to use force against the government. This is, of course, only one unpopular thing that happens in 1932. And it kind of helps you understand why Americans are about to make the choice they're about to make that November.
Later that year in 1932, America would dump Herbert Hoover for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had the idea to use government resources to do something else other than shoot brown people. This, of course, made a lot of the ruling class a bit nervous. The bankers and businessmen of America worried about FDR turning the country communist, and the newspapers they owned did the same. This didn't change public opinion, of course. FDR won in the landslide and was incredibly popular, but these people didn't care to do what was popular. The rhetoric of the time was almost satirically extreme. Much of the rich used their papers to publish articles declaring that FDR's administration would be one step away from a communist takeover, and while this was ridiculous, the 30s were an extreme time. The whole globe was awash in revolutions and extreme tensions.
So at this point, this podcast has kind of been a series of us introducing elements to you, right? So we've demonstrated in Italy and Germany and France how violent veteran organizations can assault the government, okay? So that's one ball we have juggling. Then we have juggling the ball of the business tycoons that are running America and how concerned they are about FDR and his plans to help the country, and how tied they are to both Italy and Germany, very comfortable with fascism. And then we have the final ball in the air that is the bonus army, this group of thousands of veterans that is brutalized literally in the shadow of the Capitol dome. And to finally complete our, shall we say, juggling act, we need to introduce the main character of our story, one of the most fascinating Americans to ever live, Major General Smedley Darlington Butler. Butler is one of those guys who you would read a cracked article about in 2010. He is just a nutty guy to read about. And he is often claimed by people across the political spectrum, often incorrectly. And part of doing this episode was, as Jay can confess, I just kind of really want to talk about Butler. I'm sort of enamored with the guy, even though he is, to be clear,
a big Butler fanboy.
I am a stan on Gran of the Butts. Though
so
to be
much.
clear,
I'm not a big Butler
he
fan.
was a very bad person.
Yeah.
Some would say an objectively heinous person.
Yeah.
Some would say a downright abominable person. Let's get into why. Butler was the son of a Republican congressman in Pennsylvania, and he grew up a Quaker on Philadelphia's Main Line district. He was this restless rich kid who joined the U.S. Marines at the age of 16 to go right the injustice of Spanish occupation of Cuba. This is the Spanish-American War of 1898, which Butler was very disappointed by when he didn't get to see any action. But what would then happen is Butler would then spend the next 2 decades of his life in almost constant deployment overseas. You see, Butler hadn't joined the Navy, hadn't joined the Army. It's actually funny. He wasn't allowed to because he was 16. He was lying about his age. But the recruiters for the Army and Navy were like, get out of here, kid. But then his mom, goes with him to the Marine Corps and the office, and between his mom being he's 18, I swear, and the Marine Corps, they're like, all right, kid, get on the boat. And the Marine Corps is fundamentally different from the other branches of the military at this time because it's very small. It's only a few thousand individuals. And in this period of American history, after the Spanish-American War, the Marine Corps is essentially America's go-to method to respond overseas and make other countries do what they wanted. Butler was a career soldier and he rose through the officer ranks. When you look at his deployments, it almost feels like he was everywhere. And he was most places, but it's important to remember the Marine Corps was small back then, and there were only so many guys to send. But in the first 20 years of the 20th century, if America needed a problem solved overseas, they probably sent Smedley. He sees his first real dire combat in China in 1900. This is where he shot for the first time, and at this point, he's already leading soldiers at the ages of 20 years old. Butler is then deployed in the occupation of the Philippines and all across the Caribbean. We don't have time to list all of his deployments. I read an entire book that was a biography of Butler to prep for this episode, and I could do an entire episode talking about him in Veracruz, in Guatemala, in Panama, in helping to oversee building the Panama Canal. But I've selected a few stories to illustrate what his deployments were like. Once again, I said he went to Panama to overseas and enforce the building of the canal. He served as a spy in Mexico, and he worked to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. Butler was in all of these countries to protect American business interests. What would happen in this period is that American companies would go into these countries and they would start buying stuff up, generally offering to finance the infrastructure to build banana plantations and the like. This is where the term banana republic starts to pop up all over Central America and the Caribbean. Once local governments protested or tried to nationalize stuff, United States Marines would be set in to protect American assets. They would often replace the government with one friendly to business and or force the government to be run by financial advisors who were appointed by the US government, but just coincidentally happened to work for the bankers and businessmen who had bankrolled the election of the American president and Congress at the time. These financial advisors would make the affected country take loans, but wouldn't tax American businesses in the country. This means that the government wouldn't have any tax income to pay off the loans. And once they couldn't pay back the loans, these American financial advisors, who again are just lawyers who work for, say, the United Fruit Company or whatnot, would force the sale of national assets to private American corporations. And if anyone starts rioting or the local army gets irate, what do? You send in the Marines. Butler did this in plenty of places, but the biggest was in Haiti, where he was the military arm of an occupation that began roughly 1914, 1915-ish. Part of the story is that Haiti owes money to the French and the Germans at this time, as well to the United States. And Jay, what's happening to the French and the Germans in 1915?
Oh, well, they're just casually mowing each other down by the hundreds of thousands in the trenches of the Western Front of World War I.
Yeah, they are distracted. So the U.S. is like, well, now we're the only people who can enforce the loans to Haiti, so we're going to go in and do that. And this leads to Marines just straight up robbing the Haitian National Bank to make it so that Haiti couldn't pay back their loans to the United States. Please look this up if you think I'm lying about this. I really wish I was lying about this, but this is a real thing that happened in history. So Butler goes in 1915 to oversee the occupation of Haiti. And some highlights of this include him holding their legislature at gunpoint, having Marines stand next to ballot boxes as Haitians voted on a new constitution that America wrote for them, chasing Caco rebels through the jungle that ended in a massacre that would haunt him forever, and starting a local police force called the Gendarmes that forced Haitians to build roads and enforce the peace at a barrel at a gun. This was all so bad, by the way, that the United States government would launch a congressional investigation into abuses in Haiti in 1921. And I just want you guys to think about, like, what would require the U.S. Congress of 1921, like how bad something would have to be for them to care about human rights abuses.
Yeah.
That was what we were doing to Haiti at the time.
Yeah.
And Butler was the guy in charge. And Butler was not the guy at the top of it, but he was in charge of most of the military stuff at the time.
Yeah. Over the course of his deployments, you can see him beginning to question the legitimacy of his cause and begin to realize that he's just protecting the interests of some madcap bankers, in his own words. Now, Butler was a hard man. He went on brutal campaigns that involved him trekking for weeks through jungles during monsoon conditions and climbing uncharted mountains. He watched many of his friends die. He killed dozens personally and was responsible for the deaths of possibly hundreds, maybe thousands. He also suffered from several nervous breakdowns over the course of his career. He clearly viewed the locals, wherever he was, as racially beneath him, but often voiced sympathy for their plight.
Yeah, and this is where, depending on like what your political views are and like how you want to like show Butler off, you can kind of paint him in various lights. It's part of the book that I read, which I'll just plug right now because it was a source of a lot of the research for this episode. Gangsters of Capitalism, which, despite having an awful title, Jonathan M. Katz did honestly an amazing job of like I was gonna read this book just because I wanted it for research, but this is legitimately like an interesting, well-written book. The sections of the chapters are relatively short, so it keeps a nice brisk pace where there's plenty of stopping points. It gives a lot of in-depth pictures of what these countries that Butler looks like now, and what those countries like think of him. And the American forces that he represents. And if you're interested in all of this and want a better explanation of like how this mechanism of the U.S. going in and taking over these countries' banking systems and whatnot works, I would highly recommend, again, Gangsters of Capitalism by Jonathan M. Katz, and would thank him for his work that helped make this abomination of an episode possible. Butler was, again, the guy was a fucking Quaker, and he came from a deeply religious background, but, you know, he literally goes into the army as a child, or goes into the Marines as a child, and obviously he has all of these thoughts of, like, you know, grand heroics and taming the savages that are, you know, all being dumped into his head as the propaganda at the time. You know, just think about the shit you believe as a 16-year-old. And when you read the way he describes the various people he rules over and oppresses, like, you'll get these, like, strange passages where, like, on one paragraph that he's writing to his mom or his dad or his wife, he'll refer to, say, a Nicaraguan or a Haitian as just a racial slur. And the next paragraph, you'll see something to the effect of him saying, well, you know, the people who are really going to suffer are the people. You know, the locals, they're the ones who are actually bearing the brunt of all of this, not the politicians that are ruling them, whatnot. He can be strangely sympathetic at times, and the guy is not, like, as monstrous as he is, and Butler was a monster. I do not think he was a psychopath. He was a very smart man. There's a lot of times in Haiti where he would, for example, give protection to a village from a rebel faction or provide them with resources in exchange for information. He was very good at playing people against each other this way. You can find, if you cherry pick, you can find a lot of positive stories about him. There's even a story of a black regiment in World War I where a member of that regiment sort of offhandedly mentions that an officer that kind of has to be Butler based on the math showed more humanity than your average American officer would to a black soldier at the time. Butler's a complicated figure. As we'll get into, he did a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of people who want to show him off in many lights. Again, that massacre in Haiti is called, I think it's called the Massacre of Fort Lemaine or something like that, against the Cacos, in which about 48 people die. Bad dude, did borderline genocidal shit, did objectively imperial shit, but he was definitely not just this hard psychopath or this blind racist. He was more a guy who had just grown up on propaganda his entire life, was told that he was superior, and was very comfortable with violence, even though that violence did have some pretty extreme repercussions on his mental health. He had multiple mental health crises over the course of his life. PTSD was decades away from being understood at this point. And he often talks about the only way he got through these deployments was by often keeping his wife and children surprisingly close to him when he was stationed in, say, Panama or Haiti.
Yeah.
In World War One, it's actually very tragic. Butler kind of saw World War One as his chance to sort of step onto the big stage of Europe after being sort of bandied about what he thought of as a sort of, lesser places his entire career. What he gets to do in World War One as a brigadier general is man a camp at the back of the lines, and he essentially spends a year watching thousands of American soldiers coming back killed and utterly mangled from the front. And this kind of breaks Butler for a bit and sort of sours him to military service. Just to sort of wrap up his career, in 1942, he would take a break from military service to become the police commissioner of Philadelphia for 2 years, where he basically invents militarized policing in America after bringing his tactics from Haiti to local soil. By the way, there are some people who will tell you that Butler was so, intense and so violent, and, he straight up just, told his cops to, go out and shoot what he called bandits. And he was an avid enforcer of prohibition. But Butler was, so violent, people will tell you the citizens of Philadelphia, revolted against him. That is not true. Butler was shit-canned as the police commissioner because he started getting too close to the money. And he started sniffing up the criminal business interests of the people who had put the mayor of Philadelphia in his position. That was why he left. After that, in 1927, he oversees U.S. troops in Shanghai during the Chinese Civil War, possibly delaying the Sino-Japanese War by as many as 2 years, depending on who you ask. And this is where I will insert my final, just weird, eccentric Butler story. The dude is weird. There's tons of stories, and we have thousands of pages of his letters and correspondence, so you can really get a sense of his personality. Dude's an extreme guy. I've heard that I just said he was a staunch prohibitioner, and he was. But before that, there was a part in his life where he was just a raging alcoholic. Guy was an extreme dude. But anyway, when he's stationed in China, there's two separate occasions where he does basically an act of kindness for a small Chinese village. There's one case, I think, where he essentially dissuades the Japanese army from moving in there. No, it wasn't actually the Japanese, it was the nationalists. It was the Kuomintang. And there was another point where he actually gets his men to fix a bridge that he needed to cross, but it also helped that village. And in those two occasions, Jay, there was this apparently Chinese sort of tradition where when bureaucrats of the Qing dynasty retired, they would be given these beautiful red umbrellas that had the names of grateful villagers sort of written on little paper tags hanging from them. And because the Qing dynasty had collapsed and there was no one else to give to, these Chinese villagers essentially just assumed that Butler was equivalent. And so Butler is given these paper umbrellas on two separate occasions by these Chinese villages. And Butler is a guy who is on record, he received the Medal of Honor twice, and he is on record saying that he did nothing honorable that deserved that Medal of Honor. One of those Medal of Honors, by the way, was for shooting at basically Navy students, 17-year-olds in Veracruz. So yes, Butler is right in that he did not do anything honorable to earn those medals. And he hated most of the commendations that the military gave him. Jay, get this. Butler put these umbrellas that these Chinese villagers gave to him in his house, and he displayed them in his main hallway. You would see you would see them when you walked in. Of he's this is my most proud accomplishment.
Yeah.
Again, the guy's weird as hell. Then he goes back home writing a desk, which, as you can imagine, he is terrible at. And he also isn't in the best financial situation, or he's doing all right, but this is a guy who comes from a lot of rich money. His wife comes from a lot of rich money. Remember, his dad is in Congress. And so in order to supplement the family income, he starts taking speaking gigs in the late 20s, early 30s. People love hearing his stories. I mean, you've been hearing me go on for a while, probably too much, about his stories. And he starts telling a few too many, shall we say, true stories, and speaking his mind a little too much about current politics. In 1931, there's a series of international incidents, essentially, where Butler will badmouth Mussolini, and then the Italian ambassador will, like, ask for a formal apology from the government. And this, along with some other incidents and him just kind of being known as a bit of a troublemaker, means that Butler never became Commandant of the Marine Corps, despite being next in line for it. He retired at the rank of a 2-star Major General. After he got out, he would speak more and more, and he would end up taking up the cause of the bonus marchers, speaking at their camp one of the days shortly before MacArthur went in and ripped it apart. And you can imagine that that kind of radicalized Butler even more. And now that we have sort of all of our people in place, we can begin talking about the business plot.
Yep.
No, I did not forget the title of the episode for 1.5 seconds. I don't know what you're talking about.
In 1933, at his Newman house, Butler would be visited by a bond salesman named Gerald C. McGuire, along with Bill Doyle. Butler got a lot of visitors, and at first McGuire simply wanted Butler to speak at various meetings of the American Legion. Butler did so, being snuck into a meeting as a surprise guest. Now, the American Legion, for context, was basically a big veterans organization. I mean, still it is. At these meetings of the American Legion, however, the speeches Butler was given to deliver weren't on the subject of veteran issues, and were instead about the gold standard and other big business talking points. This, of course, made him suspicious. McGuire would meet Butler several times over the next 18 months, and would constantly speak favorably about the fascist governments in Italy and Germany, even sending Butler a postcard from Italy. As these talks went on, McGuire started pressing deeper. He began speaking to Butler about the millions of dollars his backers could throw around. At one point, he just leaves $18,000 on a hotel bed as an open bribe to Butler, who yells at him to put it away.
Butler was very pissed off by this.
Yeah.
Which you can imagine, like, an honorable soldier who, like, grew up in, like, Quaker Philadelphia high society, like, just like, McGuire just fucking leaves 18 grand on a hotel bed.
And that's like 18 grand in 1934 money.
And also he basically was like, oh, it slipped.
Yeah.
like just we'll get into how dumb McGuire was in a bit, but Jay, keep going.
Yeah. In 1934, McGuire began speaking to Butler about France's Croix de Feu and how Butler needed to get the soldiers together. Butler was unaware of the attack on France's capital, but McGuire certainly was.
So Butler starts to ask McGuire, like, what do you mean get the soldiers together? What do you need to do? Because at this point, Butler is, like, really suspicious of this guy. And Butler, he keeps using euphemisms. He keeps being kind of squirrely. He's like, well, we would go to the Capitol to support President Roosevelt. Well, what do you mean, support President Roosevelt? Well, just make sure he does the right thing. Help him with his job. President Roosevelt, he's an infirm man. What if we had, like, a secondary president who would do all the hard work for, the infirm and the old President Roosevelt? Roosevelt would still be there, as like a figurehead, but we would just be taking that job off of his hands. And Butler's like, okay.
As a side note, I just like how, like, Butler had to point out to McGuire that, like, there's no, like, assistant president or secondary president in the Constitution. Like, there's a vice president, but like what McGuire is talking about is just like creating a brand new position out of nowhere. And like, Butler's like, that's not in the Constitution. That'll take a lot of effort to create that.
But it also, like, makes sense that if you wanted to get someone to do a coup, arguably Smedley Butler is the one person in America who knows the most about doing coups, right? Like, this is a guy who, to reiterate, held the Haitian Senate at gunpoint and made them accept a new constitution. But that was abroad being done to non-white people, and Butler presses McGuire for, come on, who's in charge here? And this gets Butler a meeting with Sterling Clark, who is kind of acting as a liaison for the even more wealthy bankers. McGuire himself could only concretely give Butler the name of Grayson Murphy, who was the banker who he was working for at his firm. But during this whole period, McGuire has been flashing Butler bank checks for $48,000, $64,000, and he's suggesting to Butler that he could have access to $30 million, $300 million. And this, of course, like, the reason that Butler's going deeper here is he's like, well, who the fuck has $300 million? Like, that's like that would have to be multiple of the richest people in the country. Now, Clark was a soldier who Butler had actually gone on deployment with before, like 3 decades ago. He was actually jokingly called, I think it's the millionaire lieutenant, because he was this this wealthy pretty boy who did a brief stint in the Marine Corps, which Butler was also for money, but to be fair to Butler, he did make it past lieutenant. And Clark basically gives the game away to Butler. He admits that what they want to do is use the bonus army to overthrow the government. And this sort of like makes everything fall in line with Butler, you know, from them like basically sneaking him into a meeting of the American Legion, but then making him give a speech on the gold standard, to him, you know, all the talk about supporting the president. Clark essentially gives away that he's like, you know, we're going to pay the soldiers plenty, but, you know, they're going to get that bonus they want, but in reward, you know, our money is going to be maintained. At one point, Clark makes the sort of explanation to Butler. He's like, listen, I have $30 million, and I'm willing to spend $15 million of that to keep the other 15.
McGuire also tells Butler that in 2 weeks' time he would see in the paper as an announcement of an organization to support veterans and defend the Constitution, as McGuire put it. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, the American Liberty League was announced in the New York Times on August 23rd of 1934. The League claimed to be a veterans organization dedicated to supporting the Constitution, but all of their policies and advocacy centered around opposing the New Deal. Among the Liberty League's founders were Irene DuPont of DuPont Chemicals, Alfred P. Sloan, the head of General Motors, the executives of Phillips Petroleum, Sun Oil, General Foods, McCann Erickson Ad Agency, and former Democrat presidential candidates Al Smith and John Davis.
So, Butler, again, he's been courted on and off for a year now, but between, like, but, you know, it's all been talk and flashing money, but now Butler, and we're now, again, in late August of 1934, he sees an organization being founded, backed by deep pocket capitalist money, to get a bunch of violent soldiers together, and he's like, well, I should do something about this. So, in November of 1934, Smedley Butler approached the House Committee on Un-American Activities. that he had a testimony on a plot against the nation.
Now, this committee was chaired by Representative Samuel Dickstein and John William McCormack. Dickstein in particular was really the force behind the creation of the committee. He was Jewish, he was quite opposed to fascism and Nazism in specific, and had actually gone to Europe several times and kind of like witnessed what was going on in Europe. Now, previously, the special committee had basically been holding hearings across the country in Chicago, New York, I think Boston as well, and basically they saw themselves as rooting out, groups which were connected to the Nazi party and to other fascist European parties. They had gone after some people for spreading Nazi propaganda, and they had, they had even gone after a guy who was actually kind of like lobbying for IG Farben, the German chemical company and supporter of the Nazis that we mentioned earlier. They didn't have much legal power to actually, punish people. This is not a court. It's just a committee, but they were pretty committed to this role. So they were pretty much a logical place for Butler to end up at.
And I'd imagine they were the most ardent members of the House of Representatives at the time at fighting Nazi propaganda and being anti-fascist.
Yes, yeah.
Which
at the end of the day,
might not have been the most popular of stances.
No, at the end of the day, they will basically have their budget cut, and it'll be transformed into the more famous, House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1938, and they'll be replaced mostly by conservatives who use that committee mostly just to go after communists. But for this brief period, they're going mostly after fascists.
That's nice. I did not expect a heartwarming twist of this story. So Butler appears before these two guys. He does not come alone. He comes with someone to back up his story. A reporter named Paul French. French testified after Butler. I have read all of Butler and French's testimony. I dug through a very, very long PDF, which is a occasionally very poor scanning of congressional documents to research this episode.
Oh man, so many digitized documents are like some intern scanned it in like 2005 or something, and they look terrible. Like, I've gone through so many government documents just over the years that look like that.
You can see the curvature of the end of the line as they're like slamming it into the copyright. There's like pages where just like half the page is just like 3 times more transparent and faded compared to the rest of the page. This is on top of having to deal with super smashed together 30s font. Shit. Okay. So French testifies that he basically just like went to McGuire's office and asked him about what he thought about many things, and then kind of like as he'd buttered up, got him to talk about what his plans were with Butler. And if French is to be believed, like if what he's saying is true, McGuire is even more of an idiot than you probably think he is. He says to French, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists who want to tear it down and wreck all we've built in America. The only men who have the patriotism to do it are the soldiers, and Smedley Butler is their ideal leader." He often talked to French about the need for a, as he put it, man on a white horse to lead the nation, which French very rightly assumed he was talking about a dictator. Before that, Butler had testified to everything I had said to you before. You can read his testimony if you want. It's a bit rambling. They occasionally cut in to ask him questions, but Butler just kind of goes. He tells the two men about the timeline, the bribes, all of the cash and bank checks that McGuire is flashing, everything they said about the American Legion. And after this, the committee would call McGuire to testify. McGuire would show up with a lawyer, and he would be interrogated several times for a combined amount of testimony that I believe is longer than Butler and French put together. This part was a lot harder to read, and I'm not gonna lie, my eyes may have glazed over a little bit while reading it, because a lot of it is just like the committee chairman being like, well, where'd this 15 grand in your bank account tied to a German corporation come from? And then like he answers and like, well, where's this? And this just goes on for like a dozen pages. But essentially what McGuire says in testimony is he's like, oh, no, I would never like make such bold claims. And then he begins to just like outright perjure himself. So he'll basically like confirm Butler's story, but say it in a way where he'll omit tons of details. So he'll say, oh, well, it's true that we smuggled Butler into a meeting of the Foreign Legion, but we never gave him a speech to read about the gold standard. We just wanted him to say his piece and stuff like that. Sure, I took him to see Clark, but I just thought they were old war buddies. I have no idea what they were talking about. And this all leads to a final report, which I'm going to read part of now. This is the final report of the committee. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. There is no question but that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. This is what we now call the business plot. Now, you may have noticed that that is a very, very vague statement. You may have also noticed a lot of what we've just told you in the past 20 minutes revolves on the testimony of two guys and kind of a lot of conjecture. So now Jay's going to run down what we know for sure.
So what do we know? Well, we know Butler was very good at coups, leading men in battle, and was used to violence against civilian leaders. He was one of the most famous and respected soldiers in the US. I mean, I've even read that he was probably like the third most famous officer at this point in time, just behind MacArthur and Pershing. It's also factually true that Butler was paid to give those speeches at the American Legion, and that he had a correspondence with McGuire. Now, we have to believe Butler on what McGuire spoke to him about, but he does have collaborating witnesses, and McGuire's denials do not. There's also just a lot of shady stuff with McGuire, like a lot of the money sort of he mentioned about, he talks about getting money from this, source, or sending money here, and there are lots of checks and everything. A lot of those he wasn't actually able to explain where exactly he was getting money from or where he was sending money to, so...
Yeah, and McGuire is a bond salesman. He's a man with money, but he is certainly acting as the gopher of some very powerful interests in order to be flashing around these numbers.
Yeah.
He's the fall guy.
Yeah. We also know that many American capitalists and business interests actively feared Roosevelt's New Deal and found European fascist regimes more to their liking. The American Liberty League did exist and was basically an astroturfing operation by wealthy industrialists. Several other organizations were founded in similar circumstances, and the wealthy funded many propaganda operations against Roosevelt. Most of these were scuttled in 1936 after Roosevelt won re-election in a landslide, but, they did exist.
Yeah, the ALL would mostly stop functioning after 36 and would, I think, be, fully gotten rid of in 1940.
Yeah. We also do know that the committee's investigation was very short and didn't lead to many actions. I mean, the committee itself basically had an expiration date. It was a special committee that had only been commissioned and funded for a pretty short period of time. Most of the rest of Congress was not really infused by it. They thought that committee would be better off going after communists than fascists, and indeed, when it would eventually turn into the House Committee on Un-American Activities, they would mostly go after communists. And this was a committee, again. This is not a court. They could only make recommendations. They did make several recommendations to Congress, including that it should be made illegal for anybody to propose to American soldiers or reservists activities that went against American law. That did actually end up being passed by Congress after a lot of debate. I wonder why somebody would be opposed to that, but yeah, they didn't really have the ability to go down and really do a proper criminal investigation on Butler's allegations.
They also never questioned McGuire's employer, Grayson Murphy, which I have always found strange. There wasn't a massive attempt to follow the money trail. That certainly had to happen, because again, where is McGuire getting all this money? Finally, this is not exactly a piece of evidence to the business plot's existence, but there is the fact that once this was announced, but Butler had no intention of keeping this secret because he wanted this all to be stopped. And he brought a reporter with him to do this. And basically the day after these testimonies, the entire media establishment basically runs the headlines announcing that Butler is accusing this fascist plot of existing, but mostly derides and dismisses it as nonsense. This is the New York Times, this is Reader's Digest, these are the most powerful newspapers of the time, and a lot of these newspapers are owned by people who could possibly have been in the business plot. And just to give you an idea of what these articles looked like, they're not all calling, Butler insane or whatnot, but most of them feature this sort of subtle bias where, for example, they will spend a lot more time publishing the denials of the people who Butler accused rather than Butler's statements themselves. And there's just ways that they'll use word choice or framing to kind of make Butler sound like an insane crank and that this is all nonsense, which everyone accused said it was nonsense. And the fact that the media was so coordinated in denying Butler would make someone more conspiratorially minded, maybe a little more suggestive to believe this was real. But this is a conspiracy, right? This sounds insane. The idea that the wealthiest men in America are plotting a coup of FDR, which factually did not happen. Probably the greatest evidence against the business plot being planned is that the business plot didn't happen. And this is where we need to go into what we don't know to tell the other side of the story. Firstly, we will never know all of McGuire's sponsors and how in line or out of line he and Clark were with the rest of the conspirators. Let's say, for an example, that there was a cabal of wealthy business leaders who were chatting about overthrowing the President of the United States. It is factually true that McGuire was backed by people who were far, far wealthier than him, millionaires. But if he was, it's completely possible that McGuire was being represented by a sort of extreme or radical faction of this group, and that he had gotten way out of line or way overstepped his duty in approaching Butler. We also don't know how much of the media reaction to Butler's claims were genuine or were rigged in favor of the rich who owned the papers. We can't say for sure that it was a coordinated action to discredit him. That would be disingenuous. We also obviously don't know how many people would have been in on the business plot. if they really were, and we also don't know, like, how committed they were. You know, maybe this was just some drunken, wish-washy thinking, and McGuire and maybe, like, two other crazies took it way too far. Or maybe there was a massive operation being put in place, and they were prospecting multiple people, and, you know, McGuire just got caught, and then they scuttled the entire thing and never went through with it.
A lot of arguments for and against the business plot. You know, we can see many potential holes in the theory. Again, we can say one of the greatest arguments against the existence of the business plot is how little was actually done to bring it about. You know, this plot allegedly was involving, I've seen, you know, McGuire mentioned figures as extreme as 500,000 soldiers, or I should say, Legion members. And for context, Pershing's expedition to Mexico, which was a pretty big event for the U.S. military back in 1917, consisted of 10,000 people. 500,000 is massive for the U.S. military.
It could reshape the country.
Yeah, and you know, like, if they were organizing this, like, it had to have involved tons of people beyond McGuire and even Butler. Of course, you could say, well, they were very early on in this, so they hadn't gone around to a lot of the, the nitty-gritty about organization. We can also say that McGuire and his associates are pretty dumb. Perhaps they weren't actually planning anything, or perhaps because most people, especially a lot of bankers, and especially a lot of fascists, are pretty dumb. You know, it could be true that they were coming up with a plot, and that the plot was very stupid. That's not mutually exclusive. A cursory look into Butler's history would set off red flags that he was not down with the fascist coup. One could simply look at his history of insulting Mussolini to know that he was definitely not totally down with fascism.
Another fun fact is that Butler and FDR were, like, friends. Like, they knew each other. They had spent a while together in Haiti. There's, like, a famous photograph in Haiti of Butler and FDR together where FDR is wearing a gendarme uniform that Butler is commanding to oppress the Haitian people.
Yeah.
If you wanted a dude who wanted to go against FDR, Butler is not your guy.
I really think McGuire probably just went Butler because, like I said, after Pershing and MacArthur, he was the most famous guy. And MacArthur was at the time chief of staff of the army. And I think even McGuire probably would have realized that, you know, proposing treason to somebody who is actually, like, actively high up in the military, you know, currently could, you know, get him in a lot of trouble. Pershing, I guess, was not really just that as politically involved as the other two.
Yeah, and this is another, like, wrinkle of history, right? Because, like, if you look into the psychology and the politics of Douglas MacArthur, I have no doubt that he would be totally down with overthrowing the United States government, installing himself as
MacArthur
dictator.
Did not like Roosevelt. MacArthur
he hated him. Butler, during his congressional testimony, in fact, mentions that there's a faction of the coup that, like, McGuire had, like, offhanded said to him that preferred MacArthur instead of going to Butler. FDR himself openly feared MacArthur. He was a guy who nakedly wanted power. Perhaps things just didn't line up, right? Like, if you're these guys playing this coup and, like, you want to use the bonus army, but you also want to use MacArthur, well, that doesn't work, right? Because remember, MacArthur fucking broke the bonus army and chased them out of town on tanks. But no, it probably would have been way smarter for them to go to MacArthur than to go to Butler, and history might have gone differently.
We also don't have any minutes or written correspondences from members of the business plot speaking about their intentions. We have plenty of correspondence, mountains of it, about, you know, how much the rich in the 30s hated FDR, but that's not exactly hard evidence. If the business plot did exist, it was scuttled very early in the planning stages. Perhaps some backers were far more invested than others. Perhaps the people Maguire represented were the more eager wing of the conspiracy and got a little ahead of themselves. If this thing existed, it was very poorly planned.
Now, some of you who are more educated into fascism are also probably raising some eyebrows at all of this. Because even though there are a lot of similarities between the three stories that we told you and the business plot, there's also some massive differences. For one, this is not true fascism by any means. And if businessmen were really trying to replicate what was happening in Europe, they misunderstood the process. Fascism is a bottom-up movement that folks already in power take advantage of. Instead of channeling pre-existing fascist movements in the United States, they attempted to sort of astroturf their own, and it failed. They wanted the masses to help them, but they had nothing to offer them. You know, maybe there's an alternate history where these guys have more success, maybe, say, backing Father Coughlin and getting him to run for office. But it just never really came together because this wasn't like a violent, purely racist, like, attempt to reforge what America stood for. This was just the people who were already on top of American society wanting to be more secure at their place at the top. To wrap up, I have done a lot of thoughts about fascism, and I've had a lot of my thoughts changed while researching this episode. I started this project thinking that the business plot was a fascist attempt to overthrow the government, because that's what I had heard it talked about in like pop history and a few articles across the internet. What I came to was a lot thinner evidence than I thought it was, and I almost have to be puzzled because I look at countries like France, and there was even we didn't talk about it, but a large, fascist movement in Britain, and have to kind of wonder, why is America so exceptional? Why didn't it happen here? And the sort of answer I have to come to is that it wasn't exactly, say, liberalism that defeated fascism or the democratic process in the United States. I kind of think, in many ways, it was conservatism that stifled fascism in the United States. The U.S. may have been a mess in the 30s. It may have been some of the most strife and poverty that the nation has ever seen, utterly horrific, but it was not nearly as bad as, say, Germany or Italy. And you didn't have, say, next to Italy, whole cities being occupied by armies for a year on end. You didn't have massive gangs of street fighters. Ultimately, these are capitalists who are trying to make this revolution happen, but things were already going great for the capitalists. The conservative hand of, at that point, free market capitalism, and after the war, neoliberal capitalism, was already churning away fine, and they were making their money. You could argue that fascism didn't happen in America because it wasn't needed.
Yeah, and to kind of go off of that, you see in European fascism, a lot of what it leans into, and an integral part of it is racism. But you think in America at the time period, what was the biggest racist ideology in America? Well, it was the hatred of blacks by whites.
Which was enshrined in law all over the country and being enforced by cops and National Guardsmen and whatnot.
And it was a central part of the Democratic Party that FDR was a part of. People kind of forget that. Like, this was before the split. The Southern Democrats were the Dixiecrats. They were all racist.
Oh, they were all lined up behind FDR, and FDR was fine with all of that shit.
So, yeah, people who are, you couldn't really energize that sort of racist angle to go against FDR because FDR's party was the party of Jim Crow. This is, as we've talked about multiple times, and as you might tell over the course of this episode, the business plot is kind of hard to research. And a lot of that just comes from a lack of really good, thorough historiography on it.
Yeah, this is the true failure. This is the true incompetence that we're going to leave you with. Is that, like, I think that the business plot, maybe it's a story of incompetent business interests trying to overthrow FDR and, like, blabbing to the wrong guy and then getting basically the teacher called on them and they have to stop. But, like, Jay, there's just so much misinformation out there about this thing,
a
right?
lot of it, like the first person to write a really like big book on the business plot is a guy named Jules Archer. I don't say historian because Archer is not a historian, but he is, he wrote a big book, portraying the business plot as this deep, insidious, scheme that was certainly going to happen, that had backing of all the people we mentioned, DuPont, Morgan, General Motors, everybody was involved in that. And in order to kind of like go on, in order to make these arguments, he's basing a lot of his research off of a journalist who was a contemporary of the business plot named Spivak. The problem is Spivak was, let's just say, a biased source. I mean, Spivak wrote for a paper called The New Mass, which was pretty much Marxist aligned, but he also had his own biases. He was a bit of an anti-Semite. He went so far as to say that the American Jewish Committee was also behind the business plot because of their like financial interests outweighed, the fact that fascists are anti-Semites. And there's just
That's
a lot.
Just wonderful.
Yeah, and like there's just a lot in Archer's book, which is him like more or less writing it as this almost like a detective story with Butler being the hero, kind of sniffing out all the details. Other historians would more or less not take it seriously. Arthur M. Schlesinger, who was a very prominent and influential American historian, he was also a close associate of many American politicians, including most famously John F. Kennedy, dismissed the plot as, in his words, a cocktail putsch, basically saying that, it was real in that it was just the scheme that, McGuire and a couple other kooky businessmen came up with, but they didn't have any really deep connections, and there was nothing really strongly planned. And because of Schlesinger's influence, most historians since then have simply rolled with that. Then it was, McGuire was a bit of a kook, maybe he was friends with some wealthy businessmen, but it wasn't really a serious plot.
And then what this leaves is it creates this academic vacuum, right? And then, you're just some Joe Blow, and you hear that this, quote, business plot exists, that, like, a bunch of fascists were trying to overthrow America, and especially, like, if you're, politically inclined or conspiratorially inclined to believe that a bunch of American businessmen would be fascists and try to overthrow America, you start doing a little bit of investigations, and you do something like I did while researching this podcast, where you wind up on a website and you start reading an article, and then you say to yourself, wait, hold up, let's do some due diligence, and you go to the homepage to sort of get a sense of what this website is about, and you're like, oh, these people are totally into QAnon. Wonderful. And that was like the fourth Google result.
The best source, that I found describing the business plot for this episode is a thesis paper, The Forgotten Treason, The Plot to Overthrow FDR, by an undergraduate student from Wesleyan University, Emily Lacey Marshall. And it's if anybody really wants to know more about the business plot, I definitely recommend looking it up.
It's a surprisingly well-written paper.
But yeah, like this is an undergraduate thesis paper. And it's one of the best summaries of the business plot, that was probably written in decades.
Which, on one hand, golf clap to her, but on the other hand, what the fuck? And as evidence to how muddied researching the business plot is, and like how much misinformation is around there, we kind of want to talk about a little fella named Prescott Bush, who, if you're probably guessing, is the father of H.W. Bush and the grandfather of George W. Bush. An important guy who, if you start doing a little research on the internet into the business plot, you will often see listed as one of the, quote, co-conspirators. And if you go to Prescott Bush's Wikipedia page, you will see that he is listed as a co-conspirator in the business plot. This is, seems to be completely made up. Jay, you want to go off about that?
There, as you mentioned, there are sources that you can say claiming that Prescott Bush was heavily involved, and there are sources which say there's no evidence linking him to the plot at all. It does seem in this case the latter is true. The link between Bush and the business plot seems either to come from a misinterpretation of the evidence, of the fact that Bush actually is linked to various business interests, which were working with German companies such as IG Farben and Tyson and Krupp. But there's nothing in Maguire's statements that would actually link Bush himself. Bush also doesn't seem to have been involved with the groups who were allegedly backing Maguire.
Yeah, I've heard that he was also interrogated by the same committee that...
Yeah, and actually a lot of... he was involved in businesses who had their assets seized in 1940 or so because they were working with the Nazis. So yeah, Bush definitely has links with the Nazis, but it doesn't seem like he has links with Maguire or with the business plot that we can prove.
But what seems to happen at some point is that the business plot was a thing, and Prescott Bush's ties to the Nazis were a thing, just around the same period of time, and some untrained journalist or person who thinks himself an amateur historian or maybe just a conspiracy theorist just kind of tied the two together, and then that got repeated, and that got repeated, and that got repeated. So much so that when I read a book about this in 2022, there had to be a little footnote from the author saying, hey, I'm sure plenty of you have heard that Prescott Bush was into the business plot, but as far as I can tell, there's no evidence of that. So it's still a quote-unquote controversial up-in-the-air misconception. Today. 90 years later.
Yeah.
So hopefully that'll sort of paint a picture of you guys how little work has been done in this history and how little people like to talk about, say, just sort of wondering how close America got to fascism. And the episode has properly ended here, but we are continuing because this is an Azalea episode, and I never know when to shut up. And I have done so much work at this point into this shit that I'm just going to... I'm the one who has to edit this. I'm the one who has to live with the consequences. I'm gonna fucking do it. I owe you guys the story of how Butler ends. Because it would probably not be appropriate to tell his story without talking about the most famous thing he ever did in his life, at least according to the modern era perspective. Being proposed to be a part of a fascist coup by a bunch of billionaires only made Butler more cynical about the nation he served, and whether or not the business plot was real, Butler certainly thought it was. He became convinced that every action he had taken in his career was for the purpose of lining the pockets of someone on Wall Street, and to be clear, that was pretty correct. Butler voted for the socialist candidate in 1936 and was one of the 4 anti-war Americans in the late 30s who wasn't a closeted Nazi. Calling him a leftist is a little bit of a stretch. One communist said that Butler was quote-unquote on their side, but that Butler didn't understand the ideology. Butler would die in 1940, right before the U.S. entered World War II. But before that, he would publish his seminal work, War is a Racket. This is a pamphlet that you can easily read in decent PDF form on the internet, and it attempts to explain how much soldiers suffer for war and how much businessmen profit off said war. Many of its figures are incorrect, many of its sentences misconstructed, and the rhetoric is clumsy because Butler is a good speaker but not a professional writer. I think he actually did have help writing it. And despite the clumsy rhetoric, there's just this blunt brilliance to the paper that you can't reproduce outside of it. I'm going to read 2 quotes. In the World War, this is World War I, a mere handful garnered the profits of the conflict. At least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires were made in the United States during the World War. That many admitted their huge blood gains in their income tax returns. How many other war millionaires falsified their tax returns? No one knows. How many of these war millionaires shouldered a rifle? How many of them dug a trench? How many of them knew what it meant to go hungry in a rat-infested dugout? How many of them spent sleepless, frightened nights ducking shells and shrapnel and machine gun bullets? How many of them parried a bayonet thrust of the enemy? How many of them were wounded or killed in battle? Out of war, nations acquire additional territory. If they are victorious, they just take it. This newly acquired territory properly is exploited by the few, the self-same few who wrung dollars out of blood in the war. The general public shoulders the bill. And here's another quote about that bill that Butler's referring to. Boys with a normal viewpoint were taken out of the fields and offices and factories and classrooms and put into the ranks. There they were remolded. They were made over. They were made to, quote, about face, to regard murder as the order of the day. They were put shoulder to shoulder, and through mass psychology, they were entirely changed. We used them for a couple of years and trained them to think of nothing at all of killing or being killed. Then suddenly we discharged them and told them to make another about face. This time they had to do their own readjustment. Sans mass psychology, sans officers' aid and advice, and sans nationwide propaganda. We didn't need them anymore. We scattered them about without any 3 minutes or Liberty Loan speeches or parades. Too many of these fine young boys are eventually destroyed mentally because they could not make that final about face alone. And Butler is talking here about post-traumatic stress disorder. He's talking about the inability for soldiers to re-enter civilian life decades before that kind of thing became like something we talked about, but decades before that became a widespread notion in society. And he's also talking about how war serves not the nation, but the capitalists, and how it serves business interests, something that is still a radical concept today. And it is utterly insane and strange how a man who basically invented militarized policing, a man who stifled democracy in Central America, a man who enforced white supremacy on his boot heel, a man who toppled governments so the company that is now Chiquita Bananas could fucking sell shit, is saying this. I think it's pretty nutty. And you should read it if you want to. It's a pretty quick experience. And that is going to end the so far longest episode of No One Is Competent. A podcast that, as you might have guessed from this episode, is not massively competent. That's the joke. Hey, Jay.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing this episode with me. I'm sorry it became such a fucking mess. I really thought it would be easy. I was like, I got a book. I got a fun thing. This is gonna be just a super duper. And then last night I'm flipping through 1,300 pages of congressional testimony, and I'm just like, oh, this is gonna be the worst thing. And maybe it is the worst thing. Maybe this is the worst episode we've ever made. Never will
It is.
make.
It is. It is not. Don't worry about that. I think it came off pretty well, actually.
Thank you for your. I really need to go pass out. Jay, what are our plugs? What should people do? What do they do with their lives?
They should, go to the various different platforms that we are on. Of course, we're on YouTube at No One Is Competent, as well as, iTunes, Spotify, and various other podcast platforms.
Get us to 10 reviews on iTunes. I just want the double digits. 10 reviews, people.
Rate,
give it
review,
to me.
Like, comment, subscribe, ring the bell. You can always find us on Twitter as well at not_competent. And you can email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com if you have any episode suggestions or feedback, or just want to yell at us. Anything's welcome. And that's about it.
We actually do have one of our episode suggestions like in the chamber as
yes.
2 or 3 episodes from now. So we do pay attention to that.
Yeah, if you have made a suggestion to us, we do consider them, and we do. All the suggestions which we've received are somewhere along
on the
pipeline. Yeah. Our music is by Sam Bryce, and I think that about sums it all up.
I'm gonna see Sam on Tuesday. I'm making everybody I'm making I'm making gnocchi stew with
Ooh,
kale
nice.
and hot sausage.
I like gnocchi.
It's gonna be delicious. Y'all be good.